World of Warcraft's first new class came into the game with a bang in Wrath of the Lich King, originally being without a doubt the most overpowered thing we've ever seen in the game. It could really do anything as any spec, which was, you know, fun for a while, but as they say, no king rules forever. Over the course of Wrath of the Lich King, the Death Knight was toned down and brought more in line with the power level of other classes, but even still they remained a very good DPS and tanking pick. Heading into Cata, we see Blizzard solidify the roles that the DK will be associated in expansions moving forwards, as well as having reworks to core systems such as their runes. As per usual, any race can be a Death Knight, including the two new ones in Worgen and Goblin. But with that said, let's begin and check out the Death Knight in Cataclysm. But first I want to do a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, Factor 75. Factor 75 are kind of a regular on this channel at this point, and for good reason. They offer delicious dietitian approved meals which are delivered straight to your door. These meals are calorie counted, and there's a menu that rotates weekly to keep options fresh. Speaking of options, there are a bunch of them, ranging from keto, calorie smart, vegan, vegetarian, and plenty more. In a busy world, Factor 75 provide convenience to make meal time quick, easy, and organized. No more random takeouts or forgetting to buy that one thing from the shop that you wanted. Everything you need will be in the fridge and ready to go. And the best part is the food is ready in about 2 minutes or so. It's microwave food, but just not in a way you've had it before. So why not give them a try? You can go to my link and get 50% off your first Factor 75 box and wellness shots for life. That'll be 2 free wellness shots per order with an active subscription. Many thanks to Factor 75 for the sponsor today. Let's get back to WoW. Starting off with our baseline class changes. First up is that similar to how it's played in Wrath, Blood would now be the go-to tanking spec, and Blood Presence has also been updated to match this playstyle. Unholy would become the master of undead minions wielding a two-handed weapon. Well, at least we expect them to do so this time. Unholy ended up dual wielding throughout Wrath, strangely enough, but this time around you should be back to your two-hander. And Frost is the fast-paced DPS which conflicts into two-handed weapons or dual wielding. There is also a pretty big change to how the rune system works as a whole. Now, instead of your runes regenerating as soon as they are spent, they will instead regenerate one after the other. So, say in Wrath at the moment you've spent both of your Frost runes, they will both be regenerating at the same time. This can lead to some awkward scenarios where, as they both come off of cooldown, you don't actually have anything to spend them on if you put other runes out of sync by mistake. If you take the same scenario in Cata, where you've spent both your Frost runes, the first rune spent will start regenerating, and once that is full, the second one will begin doing so. The idea here from Blizzard was to keep resources coming in at a steady pace, rather than sometimes just getting everything at once and you can't spend them fast enough. Runes transformed into death runes, which count for any rune, also follow this system and will regenerate in order relative to the rune they started as. So say if we have a Frost and Unholy rune transformed into death runes, you technically can have 2 death runes coming back up at the same time, but these runes have to fill before the other runes, whether transformed into death or not, will begin regenerating. At first glance, this seems like a straight up nerf to rune regeneration, and the DK will consequently feel much slower to play, and this just isn't true. There is also a new passive ability called Runic Empowerment in the Frost tree, which gives each spec's main runic power spender a 45% chance to instantly activate a fully depleted rune, including death runes. Also, each spec has a bunch of ways to easily transform a number of their less used runes into death runes too, just to help with your rotation, and a bunch of abilities have had their rune costs changed too to be on the cheaper side. And finally, haste effects will now also improve the speed at which your runes regenerate. So overall, things will feel a bit different on your DK, but hopefully it should feel a bit more of an intuitive and forgiving system compared to how runes worked throughout Wrath. In the Blood tree, this is of course now the established tanking spec. Blood Presence will increase stamina, armor contribution, and reduce damage taken, just all your usual tanking things. Death Strike gets a big buff and is one of the reasons tanking as Blood is so good, good, as the healing it does will now scale with damage received recently. Disease spread via pestilence will now only do 50% damage as well. New for Blood is Dark Simulacrum, which places a debuff on the enemy that will allow the DK to copy their next spell. Over in Frost, Frost Presence now increases damage by 10% and runic power generation by 10%. Obliterate no longer consumes diseases by default, and Rune Strike is now an instant ability, not next melee, and it hits a lot harder. New for Frost is Festering Strike, which costs 1 blood and 1 frost. This is an instant attack which extends the duration of Blood Plague, Frost Fever, and Chains of Ice by 6 seconds. And you also get the aforementioned Runic Empowerment, which is when you're landing a damaging Death Coil, Frost Strike, or Rune Strike, there's a 45% chance to activate a random fully depleted rune. And for Unholy, Unholy Presence now gives you 10% attack speed and rune regeneration rate, 15% move speed, and a 0.5 global cooldown reduction. Death and Decay is now changed to only cost 1 Unholy rune. Raise Ally is a functional combat res now, and not an ability you can just use on someone so they can run around as a ghoul for a bit. New for Unholy is Outbreak on a 1-minute cooldown. This applies Blood, Plague, and Frost Fever to an enemy, which is great for target swapping. You also get Necrotic Strike costing 1 Unholy. This attack places a debuff on an enemy that absorbs healing. Whilst the debuff is active, their cast times are increased by 30%. Mainly a PvP focused talent aimed at annoying healers and casters. Let's start on the talent trees then and see what else we have. When you pick Blood, you get Heart Strike. This now hits the main target harder and cleaves up to 2 nearby enemies up from 1. Veteran of the Third War is a bunch more stamina and expertise and reduces the cooldown on Outbreak by 30 seconds. Bloodright makes it so runes spent on Death Strike and Obliterate will refresh as Death runes. And as standard with all tanks, you get Vengeance, which makes it so when you take damage, you deal more damage, scaling with your max health. And your mastery is Blood Shield. Each time you heal with Death Strike in Blood Presence, you gain 50% of that amount as an absorbed shield. This mastery is really good and is a big reason Blood does so well in Cata. In the talent trees, Bladed Armor is lowered to a 3-point talent and also now increases attack power by 6 per 180 armor that you have. Blood Plague now affects enemies with Scarlet Fever, reducing their physical damage dealt by 10%. This is just a passive talent to give you a demoralizing shout type effect. Bone Shield has been moved over from the Unholy tree, but still has a similar effect, reducing damage taken whilst active by 20%, as well as increasing yours by 2%. Abomination's Might is a flexible talent pick, which can be worked in if your raid needs the attack power buff. Sanguine Fortitude is a huge new talent, which makes Icebound Fortitude free to cast and increases its damage reduction effect from 20% to 50% for 12 seconds. Improved Blood Presence now makes you crit immune in PvE, whilst also increasing rune regeneration rate by 20%. And Will of the Necropolis also sees big buffs. It makes it so when you drop to low health, your rune tap will come off of cooldown and be free to cast, and you reduce all damage taken by 25% for 8 seconds, and this is only on a 45-second internal cooldown. Improved Death Strike is another incredible talent, increasing the damage of Death Strike by 120%, its crit chance by 30%, and its healing by 45%. And finally, Dancing Rune Weapon is made into more of a defensive cooldown. It'll still mirror attacks, but now also gives the DK 20% parry chance whilst active. Blood considers prime glyphs such as Rune and Heart Strike just for some more damage and threat output, as well as Death and Decay to extend the duration on this ability to make AoE better. When you pick Frost, you get Frost Strike, which is unchanged, just does a bunch of your weapon damage as Frost. You get Icy Talons for 20% attack speed, Blood of the North makes your blood runes into death runes by default, and your mastery is Frozen Heart, which just increases all your frost damage. In the talent tree, Annihilation now increases Obliterate damage by 45%, and Brittle Bones is new, allowing the Frost DK to apply a 4% physical damage taken debuff to their targets. Pillar of Frost is a short cooldown ability which increases the Death Knight's strength, as well as providing immunity to knockback effects. Frost DK still of course has Rhyme and Killing Machine for that proc heavy gameplay, where you get abilities to use for free, or the ability to guarantee that they'll crit. Hungering Cold and Chillblains can still situationally occasionally be used as CC in PvE encounters where you need to kite mobs around, which does come in Cata actually. And at the bottom of the tree there is a choice between Threat of Thessarian for dual wielding frost DKs. This makes it so your offhand will also hit with your big attacks. Alternatively, there is Might of the Frozen Waste, which grants 10% bonus damage, as well as causing auto attacks to have a 45% chance to generate 10 runic power. And finally, we have the familiar Howling Blast, which deals high damage to your main target and moderate damage to all nearby targets. The differences in Cata is that it now only costs 1 frost rune and has no cooldown, so you can really set up a lot of AoE damage on a frost DK. Frost picks up prime glyphs such as Obliterate and Frost Strike just for some extra damage, as well as Howling Blast so they can passively apply Frost Fever through that spell and not have to worry about pressing Icy Touch. When you pick Unholy, you get Scourge Strike, which is again unchanged from Wrath. It's an instant strike that does extra damage as Shadow depending on how many diseases are on the target. You get Master of Ghouls, which reduces the cooldown on Raised Dead by 60 seconds and turns your ghoul into a pet by default. You get Unholy Might for 25% more strength, and Reaping, so runes spent on Blood Strike, Pestilence or Festering Strike will come back as death runes. And your mastery is Dreadblade, which is just bonus shadow damage. In the talent tree, Morbidity increases the damage of Death Coil by 15%, as well as Death and Decay by 30%. Contagion increases the damage of diseases spread via Pestilence by 100%, which really amps up your AoE. And Unholy Frenzy has moved over from the Blood Tree to now be in Unholy, and will increase melee and ranged haste by 20%, instead of increasing their damage by 20% as it does in Wrath. Runic Corruption reduces the cost of Death Coil by 6, as well as changing Runic Empowerment. It will no longer instantly activate a depleted rune, but will instead increase your rune regeneration by 100% for 3 seconds. Shadow Infusion is new and makes it so when you Death Coil, your ghoul does 6% bonus damage, stacking 5 times. And when this is at 5 stacks, you can use Dark Transformation on your ghoul to turn it into a more powerful undead version for 30 seconds. Whilst transformed, your ghoul's claw becomes a cleave effect, Gnaw stuns for longer and does more damage, Huddle doesn't require to be channeled anymore for the damage reduction, and Leap is now a root and interrupt. So overall, this is just a big upgrade to your minion, whether it's for PvE or PvP. Improved Unholy Presence gives 10% bonus haste, and Sudden Doom has moved over from the Blood Tree, now causing auto attacks to have a chance to make your next Death Coil free to cast. Finally is Ebon Gargoyle, which is in a similar state to Wrath. You summon it in for 30 seconds, and it does nature damage to your main target. So then, how are we expecting the Death Knight to fare in PvE content throughout Cata then? Let's begin with Frost. It should have a strong opening to the expansion and bring competitive DPS on single target, as well as having a good AoE burst profile. It also has some good buff and debuff coverage, bringing 10% physical haste, a 20% attack speed debuff, and a 4% physical damage debuff. There are some other very popular picks such as Survival Hunter and Arms Warrior which can fill most of these niches too, but if you need them, Frost can certainly provide, whilst also doing respectable DPS. Frost also has that benefit of tending to not have a ton of competition when it comes to weapons, as they're going to favour dual wielding one-handed strength weapons. And yes, despite having a talent towards the bottom of the tree which allows you to spec into either dual wielding or two-handed, in PvE at least it is dual wielding which is expected to come out on top, and two-handed tends to be more of a PvP focused thing. That being said, up to the launch of Wrath, everyone thought two-handed Unholy was going to be a thing, and it just ended up not being until you got Shadowmourne, I believe. So who knows, maybe we get some surprises here as for which style of Frost does better. Frost itself should be a solid DPS choice and will be playable throughout the expansion, perhaps even being a better DK DPS spec on certain fights. However, similar to how things have been in Wrath, we once again expect Unholy to be the go-to DK DPS spec. With powerful sustained AoE through diseases and death and decay, good single target cooldowns with Dark Transformation, Unholy Frenzy and Summon Gargoyle, and even a decent raid-wide defensive cooldown in anti-magic magic zone, this spec is an all-rounder that can perform well in any environment. Unholy is also expected to be rocking a two-hander in Cata though, so if that's what you wanted out of your DK, that should now be the case. Unholy should be a solid addition to pretty much any 10 or 25 player raid, and should be a safe main pick for the expansion, which leaves Blood DK. This spec is probably one of the most buff specs in the game, to be honest, and the changes to Death Strike to scale its healing based upon your damage received, and your mastery which give a shield based off how much Death Strike heals, are really what carry you. In fact, Death Strike almost feels like an actual cooldown, but it's not. It's just a button you can press every few globals. And Blood has a lot of cooldowns. Vampiric Blood, Icebound Fortitude, Rune Tap, Blood Tap, Dancing Rune Weapon, Empower Rune Weapon, Bone Shield, Lichborn, Will of the Necropolis, and Anti-Magic Shell. And if you want even more cooldowns, you can also count Death Grip, and why not Strangulation? So yeah, you just never run out of having a button to press, which suits the scenario you're in. A good Blood DK can just give their healers some time off and be fully self-sufficient, to a far greater degree than any other tank can. And your single target threat is better because Rune Strike hits a lot harder, and AoE is just better too because you can glyph Death and Decay to extend its duration, and there's generally just stronger threat modifiers by default in Cata. So believe the Blood DK hype. This will be the main tank to play in the expansion, and will be amazing in quite literally every single area of PvE content. Next up, let's do PvP, and again I reckon things are going to be in a somewhat similar state to Wrath. We'll start off with Frost again. For PvP specifically, I think a two-handed build may be a bit more viable, because you can't always guarantee 100% uptime on enemies, so when you do connect and you're getting those big hits and crits off, that may count a bit more. Frost brings a strong set of cooldowns, including Lichborn to immune Fear, Charm and Sleep effects for 10 seconds, Pillar of Frost for bonus damage and immunity to knockbacks, and of course Hungering Cold. Hungering Cold does get a bit of a nerf in Cata, however. It now has a 1.5 second cast time, whereas in Wrath you could just instantly send it, though you can glyph it now to cost 0 runic power. All the same, it is a long duration CC for how short of a cooldown it's on, and it provides a big window of opportunity to line up burst damage or follow up with more CC. Comps with Frost should be all about that big burst with cooldowns running, and looking to catch enemies off guard once they've run through their key cooldowns and trinkets. But the spec I'm expecting to see represented a lot more is going to be Unholy. This spec is all about the consistent pressure of damage over time effects, which wear your opponents down over time. You also get Desecration. Frost can get this too, of course, and that just puts slow fields all over the place, making it so your enemies have a much harder time getting around. You of course have your permanent ghoul pet, which adds another layer of complexity and skill to the class. And you can also empower your pet too through Dark Transformation, to both give it an improved stun as well as another interrupt, so it's important you get the most out of it. Of course, Unholy packs both strong physical and magical damage mitigation, and good burst with Unholy Frenzy and Summon Gargoyle. Its only real weakness is its lack of mobility, but that's going to be a trend with DK for many expansions to come. Expect to see Unholy DKs pair up with damage over time heavy comps that want to win the war of attrition. Next up, let's check out DK's tier sets. Tier 11 is the Magma Plated set. For DPS, the 2 set adds 5% crit chance to Death Coil and Frost Strike, and the 4 set makes it so each time you gain a Death Rune or trigger Killing Machine, you gain 1% attack power, stacking 3 times. Pretty straightforward DPS set to just passively increase your damage. For tanks, you get 5% more damage on Death Strike for the 2 set, and the 4 set increases the duration of Icebound Fortitude by 50%, so it will now last 18 seconds. Following that, we have Tier 12, the Elementium Death Plate set from the Firelands. On the 2 set, Horn of Winter will now grant 3 runic power every 5 seconds for 2 minutes, just a passive addition to your runic power generation. And on your 4 set, Obliterate and Scourge Strike will deal 6% bonus damage as fire. Blood DK gets an interesting 2 set. Your melee attacks cause Burning Blood on the target, which deals 800 damage every 2 seconds for 6 seconds, and causes your abilities to act as if you had 2 diseases on your target. The 4 set makes it so when Dancing Rune Weapon fades, you gain a bunch of extra parry for 12 seconds, so just even more mitigation. And last but not least is Tier 13, the Necrotic Boneplate set from Dragon Soul. The DPS 2 set makes Sudden Doom have a 30% chance and Rhyme a 60% 70% chance to grant 2 charges instead of 1 when they proc. This should keep your resources flowing and your rotation just feeling that much better. And the 4 set makes Runic Empowerment have a 25% chance and Runic Corruption a 40% chance to also grant 710 mastery for 12 seconds when activated, and each of their masteries will just improve the damage for frost or shadow attacks respectively. And for blood, the 2 set makes it so when you drop below 35% health, one of your blood runes will immediately activate and turn into a death rune. This should pretty much guarantee you can press Death Strike, and if your health has dropped to the point where this will activate, you can assume your Death Strike is going to do a good amount of healing. And finally, your 4 set makes Vampiric Blood also affect all party and raid members for 50% of its base effect. So that'll be 7.5% max health and 12.5% healing received for 10 seconds. And this is only on a 1-minute cooldown as well, so as per usual with the tier 13 tank set bonuses, pretty insane. And that is the Death Knight in Cataclysm. It's a really well-rounded class, and if you've been a DK enjoyer throughout Wrath, believe me, it's worth a try. The big change has to be to the rune system, but I think when you've got used to playing it a bit, it'll make sense. DPS wise, I reckon Unholy will more often than not come out on top, but Frost will have its time to shine as well. And as for blood and tanking, it's probably not just only the best overall tank of the expansion, but is also the most fun due to how powerful it feels to have so much control over your health. Whilst other tanks are often sitting there waiting for a heal to land, the blood DK can be in so much more control because of how many cooldowns they have. But do let me know your thoughts on the Death Knight and whether there is anything you would add in the comments down below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you on the next one very soon.